We were a family. We were normal. And then in a split second, it was shattered. Absolutely shattered.
March 3rd, 1984. The trial of 33-year-old Arthur Gary Bishop is about to begin in Salt Lake City, Utah. This mild-mannered bookkeeper is accused of kidnapping and murder.
One of the things that was most troubling was to learn that the face of evil was so benign.
I couldn't stop, and I would go do it again if I had the chance.
This is the shocking story of how a murderer hid from justice for years, and how one seasoned detective cracked the case in a single day. In 1965, Shona and John Cunningham arrive in Salt Lake City, Utah, from Glasgow, Scotland. They hope to find a better life in a city that, thanks to its Mormon heritage, has a reputation for family values and clean living.
We had a daughter who was 15 months old and thought it would be a nice place to rear children. And we had friends here from Glasgow who thought the same thing. They had one child also.
The Cunninghams have two more children, Ian, and in 1970, Graham. By the early 1980s, they had settled into this house in a quiet part of the city. On the evening of July 14th, 1983, Graham, now 13 years old, receives a phone call.
Graham came by, and I said, "Where are you going?" Or I said, "I'm just going round to the wee store." And I said, "Well, don't be long." And that was just before 8:30 that evening. And that was the last I saw him. Never saw him again. By 1 o'clock in the morning, we called the police. When the police came, they gave us the story about it has to be 24 hours and did he run away? And I said, no, he wouldn't do that.
Shona was determined that police take serious action and not just file the case away.
Nothing much happened. Everybody was going to do something, but nothing seemed to be happening. I mean, this was my son, and I was going to find him.
At that time, she was working in a very nice French restaurant. It was very close to the courts building. A lot of judges and attorneys and civic people, politicians would go there for dinner and lunch.
I called the chief of police. I knew him, and I said, my son didn't run away.
In an effort to appease Shona, the department assigns veteran detective Don Bell to the case for 1 week only. Graham is missing for 4 days by the time Don gets to work. Despite his experience, he cannot find any sign of the boy. The most promising lead comes from Graham's school friends.
Graham, for months, had planned on going on a California vacation with a friend of his, a young boy named Jeff, and Jeff's stepdad, a man by the name of Roger Downs. And they had set this up, clear back in January. And there were a number of boys that were going to go. One by one, they kind of dropped out, but Graham was still planning on going. So this was a big trip for him.
Don makes a concerted effort to speak with the adult leading the trip, 32-year-old Roger Downs, and his stepson, 13-year-old Jeff. But he cannot reach either of them.
We did come up with another boy who said, well, you know, Jeff's dad's not really his dad. And we said, well, we know that. He's a stepdad. They go, no, he's not even a stepdad. And that got our interest. So we started doing some intensive work on trying to find Roger.
Don discovers that Roger Downs is in fact an alias. The man's real name is Arthur Gary Bishop. He also learns Bishop had used his position as a bookkeeper to steal money from his employer, the tourism agency, Ski Utah. Before he can confront Bishop, Don needs to know more about his relationship with Jeff and why Bishop claims to be Jeff's dad. To get Jeff talking freely, Don takes him into his office, alone.
He was an odd young man. He didn't respond right to my questions. And I knew all through this interview that Roger was not Jeff's dad. But through the entire interview, Jeff referred to him as my dad, my dad, my dad. I even asked him, I said, you love your dad? Yes. Does he love you? Yes. Just as a parting shot, I just asked him, I said, how long has your dad been molesting you? And there was just absolute silence in the room for what seemed like a lifetime. And the little guy said, all of my life.
It's a shocking revelation. The man outside Don's office is not just a thief and a fraudster. He's a pedophile. And Don is now seriously concerned he has done something to Graham. In Salt Lake City, Detective Don Bell is on the case of a missing boy with ties to Arthur Bishop, an alleged pedophile. Detective Bell needs to get Bishop talking fast, so under the guise of routine questioning, Don gets him in front of a tape recorder.
I started asking him, I says, we're going through the same thing with you that we've done with other adults, and we're trying to track down Graham, and when was the last time you talked with him? And he says, well, I think I talked with him midweek sometime. He wasn't real sure. I could tell that he was dancing around a lot, not being totally truthful with us, and so I changed. As I got more aggressive with him, then he started getting a little bit more uptight. And finally, I made the mistake of bringing up that I think you're another person. I thought he was going to invoke and ask for his attorney and quit talking, and I figured it was over. But I gave him his rights, and amazing, even to me, he agreed to keep talking. And that I have to freely admit, I hadn't planned for.
But even though Bishop will talk, he refuses to say anything more on tape. Don places Bishop under arrest, but for several hours keeps trying to coax him into talking again.
I said, what is the hang-up here? I said, if you tell me, I'm going to write stuff down. And he says, well, I don't want you to play the recording. I said, play it to who? And he says, the press. And I said, well, we're not going to play it to the press.
After another hour of expert persuasion, Bishop finally agrees to tell all on tape.
I said something about Graham. I said, you know, I know something's happened to Graham. Maybe he's hurt. Maybe there was an accident. And in the calmest voice whatsoever, he just goes, I said, why? He goes, he's not hurt, he's dead. Well, I said, well, how do you know he's dead? He says, because I killed him. And I think it took about 52 minutes after that for him to explain all of the murders.
Don is dumbstruck as Bishop reveals how over a 4-year period, he has killed not 1, but 5 boys. Bishop starts at the end by confessing to his 5th and most recent murder, Graham. He explains to Don that he called Graham the night he disappeared, invited him to his house, and asked him to pose naked. Worried Graham would tell on him, Bishop hits the boy over the head with a hammer, then drowns him in the bathtub.
All through this, his voice never changed. Never got emotional, never went up, never went down. Was just very calm. He said, I killed them all. I said, killed all who? He says, all the missing boys that are missing. I said, what missing boys that are missing?
Rather than start at the beginning, Bishop goes through the killings in reverse order. Bishop's grim tale goes on. He tells Don about his second murder. On November 11th, 1980, he kills 11-year-old Kim Peterson. After meeting Kim in a roller rink, he lures him to a remote desert location on the pretext of going hunting. Bishop's real intention is to take pornographic pictures, and when he suspects Kim might reveal his secret, he shoots him. Bishop ends his confession at the beginning with his very first murder. On October 16, 1979, Bishop was living in this apartment complex. Across the way was a little boy who caught his eye that day.
He was 4. His name was Alonzo Daniels. He lived in the same apartment complex. He was just standing in the doorway. He looked. There was a little guy out there playing on the lawn.
Bishop tells Alonzo that he has plenty of toys at his place, especially in the bathroom.
He says, so I put water in the tub, took his clothes off, let him play with the boat. And he says as he was playing with the boat, I fondled him. And he says the little boy kept saying, you're not supposed to do that. My mom has told me you're not supposed to touch me there. And he says, I knew if I let him go, he would tell, and then you guys would come.
With a voluntary confession, prosecutors anticipate an open and shut case. But at trial, Arthur Bishop's defense would take a shocking strategy. In the space of one Sunday afternoon in Salt Lake City, Don Bell had discovered a serial killer that no one even knew existed.
You don't come up with a missing person and your first thought is, I have some serial killer, pedophile person out there doing. That's just not on the radar as the #1 thought process.
Arthur Bishop finishes his gruesome tale in less than an hour. Fearful he will withdraw cooperation again, Detective Bell asks Bishop to take police to the boys' graves that night. He agrees to lead them into the desert, 40 miles southwest of town.
Detective Smith and another detective by the name of Johnson took him out to the desert, and it was dark. It was 10 o'clock at night, and he walked him right to the grave sites, even in pitch black dark. And that, later we found out he'd gone back to the graves and visited them periodically, so he was quite familiar.
Bishop's first 3 victims, Alonzo Daniels, Kim Peterson, and Danny Davis, were buried in shallow graves in Utah's West Desert. He took the bodies of Troy Ward and Graham Cunningham to the Wasatch Mountains and threw them into Big Cottonwood Creek, 15 miles southeast of Salt Lake City. Bishop's confession comes 10 days after Graham's disappearance. His mother, Shona, frantic with worry, still has no inkling of the terrible truth. Detectives now face the awful task of breaking the news to her.
They came to the house the next morning and brought the chaplain. I mean, that's the dead giveaway. And we sat down at the table, and they told us that Art had confessed to the murders of the 5 children. He took Graham from me that night. He knew Graham was at home, I was at home. He took him from us. Literally. That was his control. It was the godlike power of deciding whether it was going to be life or death.
By the end of the week, the Salt Lake County Attorney's Office charges Bishop with 5 counts of murder, 5 counts of aggravated kidnapping, and 1 count of sexual assault on Graham Cunningham.
We had some pretty bad ones. We'd had multiple murderers. We had people who had, done all sorts of murders. But to have 5 over a period of time, calculated, cold.
On March 3rd, 1984, Bishop's trial begins at Salt Lake City's Hall of Justice. The parents of each one of his victims are in court to hear him plead not guilty.
I had to sit and look at him. I didn't have to. I didn't need to go there, but I was bound and determined he was going to see my face if I had to look at his. And he was quite relaxed. He turned and smiled, like, oh, there's somebody I know. I mean, it was so unreal.
With Bishop's confession in hand, the prosecution has no concerns about proving he killed the boys. But to secure the death penalty, they still must prove each killing was a calculated, deliberate act. Lead prosecutor Robert Stott opens his case by painting a stark picture of the defendant, a predatory pedophile and serial killer masquerading as an upright citizen.
We tried to show how reasonable he was, how he could act normal, and how he did act normal, and how he could deceive people.
Then on March 13th, Bishop's attorneys begin their defense with a daring strategy.
They were shooting for manslaughter, claiming that he had killed them under the influence of extreme mental or emotional disturbance for which there was a reasonable explanation or excuse.
Bishop's lawyers try to persuade the jury that, fueled by pornography and coupled with his insatiable lust for young boys, Bishop developed murderous impulses that he is unable to control. When he found himself in the presence of his victims, he unthinkingly lashed out. They suggest that, in effect, each murder was an accident.
The reason he killed was not because of the pornography, not because he was desensitized, but because he was afraid these little boys were going to tell their parents, and they would tell the police, and he would go to prison.
The prosecution's case lasted for 2 weeks. Bishop's attorneys rest after just 2 days. On March 19th, the jury retires to consider its verdict. They must choose between manslaughter and first-degree murder. After 2 weeks of testimony, the jury quickly reaches a verdict in the trial of Arthur Bishop.
I can't remember how long they were out, but they were going to send them to the hotel. And within minutes, they came back and said, no, the jury has a verdict. So we all went back into court. And that's when they read the verdict.
Bishop is found guilty on all 11 counts, including 5 counts of first-degree murder.
Some people made some noise of appreciation for the verdict, which really wasn't appropriate, but everybody was so high-strung.
2 days after their guilty verdicts, the court reconvenes to decide if Bishop will be sent to prison for life or if he will be put to death.
We had a psychologist go down and interview him, and he called me afterwards, and he said there was one time where it appeared that he was expressing some remorse, and he said, Danny Davis, what a waste. And I thought he was going to say, you know, poor little boy died, you know, and instead he said, I didn't get any sexual satisfaction out of him. So it appeared to be, if there was any justification for the ultimate sanction under Utah law, this was the case.
Oh, I had no doubt. I had absolutely no doubt this man had to die.
To try and persuade the jury to recommend the death sentence, prosecutors present a chilling insight into the mind of Arthur Gary Bishop.
During the trial, we presented the testimony of the confession through Don Bell. It was at the penalty phase that we actually played the tape, because the impact of that, actually hearing his words and his voice, was so chilling. And it was very powerful.
Actually, in a way, I feel good telling about this, but at the same time, I know I'm damning myself to hell for doing it. Well, my friend, Don, I'm glad you caught me, because I couldn't stop, and I would go do it again if I had the chance. Because I get around little kids and I start shaking, I get nervous. It's just not right.
The jury deliberates for almost 11 hours. Then, at close to 1 in the morning, they return with their verdict.
Well, it's gratifying to know that 12 people agreed with us that this case, the only just penalty was death.
Well, you can say you're relieved, or you're pleased, or you're happy, or I felt the proper verdict came back.
On March 27, 1984, Bishop is given 5 death sentences. He has 1 automatic appeal before the Utah Supreme Court in 1985. His lawyers argue that the jury was biased against him and that his confession was inadmissible in court because he was not allowed to exercise his right to silence. These arguments are rejected. The court rules that his death sentence stands.
All right, would you rather die than life in prison? Yes.
Under Utah laws of the time, Bishop can choose his method of execution: firing squad or lethal injection. His choice of death by lethal injection is carried out on June 10th, 1988.
You know, time doesn't heal. Forget that. But if suddenly you lost your leg, or your arm, or your life changed so drastically that you had to find a different way to live, that's what you do. And as you become more familiar, you become a bit more proficient. If you had a prosthesis instead of your leg, you would become more efficient. But you still want your leg. There would never be a second of the day where you didn't think about your leg. And that's what you do about your children. It's been 28 years. Doesn't change. It just becomes more familiar.